Sometimes the most profound connections begin not with love at first sight, but with a stranger's courage to be vulnerable in your darkest hour. Living in apartment 4B had become a routine that felt more like a prison than a home. Every morning he would wake up to the same cracked ceiling, the same water stain that looked like a bird if you squinted just right. The divorce papers had been finalized 6 months ago, but the emptiness still felt fresh, like a wound that refused to heal properly. The building was one of those old brick structures where you could hear everything. Mrs. Chen upstairs practicing piano at odd hours. The college students next door playing music too loud on weekends. And then there was her, the woman from 4C directly across the narrow hallway. In 3 years of living there, they had probably exchanged no more than 50 words total. He knew she was a nurse because he had seen her coming home in scrubs, looking tired in that particular way healthcare workers do. Sometimes their schedules would align, and they would nod politely while checking their mail. She always smelled faintly of hospital disinfectant mixed with something floral, maybe lavender. Her apartment door had a small wreath that changed with the seasons, currently featuring autumn leaves and tiny pumpkins. The insomnia had started during the last year of his marriage, when conversations became arguments and arguments became silence. Now months later, sleep still felt like a foreign concept. He would lie in bed counting the cracks in the ceiling, listening to the building settle around him. 3 a.m. had become his most familiar hour, when the world felt hollow and every worry seemed magnified. On Tuesday nights, she worked the night shift. He had figured this out not from any conversation, but from the pattern of her comings and goings. She would leave around 6 in the evening, her footsteps quick and purposeful in the hallway. Sometimes she would drop her keys, and he would hear her muffled curse words through the thin walls. It had become oddly comforting, this routine of sounds that told him someone else was navigating life nearby. Tonight felt different, though. The October rain had been hitting his window all evening, creating patterns that reminded him of the vacation photos his ex-wife had insisted on taking during happier times. He had been lying there for 2 hours, watching the shadows dance across his walls when he heard her car pull into the parking lot below. Her footsteps in the hallway sounded heavier than usual, less hurried, almost hesitant. The building had quirks that the landlord refused to fix. Sometimes the front door didn't latch properly if you didn't give it a good push. The lock on his apartment door had been sticking lately, requiring him to jiggle the key just right. He had been meaning to call the building manager, but like many things in his life, it kept getting pushed to tomorrow. He heard her drop something in the hallway, followed by a sound that might have been crying. The walls were thin enough that he could usually tell when someone was having a phone conversation or watching television. But this was different. This sounded like someone trying very hard to keep quiet while falling apart. For a moment, he considered getting up to check if she was okay. They might not know each other well, but they were neighbors. And there was something about the sound that tugged at a part of him that still remembered how to care about other people. But then he heard her door open and close, and he assumed she had made it safely inside. The rain continued its steady rhythm against his window. He had just started to drift towards something that might eventually become sleep when he heard his front door open. Not the sound of a key turning, just the soft creak of hinges that needed oil. His heart jumped in that way it does when something unexpected happens in the quiet hours of the night. Maybe he had imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind, or the building settling, or one of those sounds that old apartments make when they think nobody is listening. But then he heard footsteps on his hardwood floor, soft but unmistakable, moving slowly through his living room toward his bedroom. The smart thing would have been to call out to ask who was there, maybe even to grab the baseball bat he kept beside his bed more out of habit than any real expectation of needing it. But something about the footsteps told him this wasn't a threat. They were too careful, too familiar somehow, like someone navigating a space they didn't want to disturb. His bedroom door, which he always left slightly open for better air circulation, was slowly pushed wider. In the dim light from the street lamp outside, he could make out a figure in the doorway. It took his eyes a moment to adjust, to process what he was seeing. But then he recognized her silhouette. She stood there for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, swaying slightly as if she might change her mind and leave. In the pale light filtering through his blinds, he could see that she was still wearing her work clothes. But something about her posture suggested that whatever had happened tonight had been harder than usual. The hospital where she worked was known for being understaffed and overworked. He had heard other neighbors mention it when they talked about the challenges of living in a city where healthcare workers were stretched too thin. Maybe tonight had been one of those shifts that broke something inside her, the way some nights had broken things inside him during the worst parts of his marriage. She raised her hand to her face and he realized she was crying. Not the dramatic crying of movies, but the exhausted, silent tears that come when you have been holding everything together for too long and suddenly can't anymore. It was a sound he recognized because he had made it himself, alone in this same room, during the months when his life had been falling apart in slow motion. What happened next would change everything between them, creating a bond neither of them had expected or planned for, born out of the simple human need to not be alone in the darkness. She stepped into his bedroom like someone walking through water, each movement slow and deliberate. The streetlight outside cast long shadows across the floor, and he could see that her face was streaked with tears she hadn't bothered to wipe away. Her work uniform was wrinkled in a way that suggested a particularly difficult shift, and there were spots on her scrubs that looked like they might be coffee or something worse. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain still pattering against the window. "I know this is crazy. I couldn't go into my apartment. I couldn't be alone tonight." He sat up in bed, pulling the covers around his waist, suddenly aware that he was only wearing an old t-shirt and shorts. The whole situation felt surreal, like he was dreaming except for the very real sound of her breathing and the faint smell of hospital antiseptic that always seemed to follow her home from work. "What happened?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. He had learned during his marriage that sometimes people needed to talk, and sometimes they just needed someone to witness their pain without trying to fix it. Instead of answering immediately, she began unbuttoning her work shirt with shaking hands. For a moment, panic flashed through his mind about what this might mean, what she might be expecting, but as the shirt fell away, revealing a simple white undershirt beneath, he realized this wasn't about attraction or desire. This was about someone who needed to shed the weight of her day, literally and figuratively. Her uniform pants followed, leaving her in basic undergarments that were practical rather than alluring. She wasn't trying to seduce him. She was trying to escape from whatever version of herself had walked through his door. The person who had spent the day dealing with other people's pain and emergencies, who had to be strong and competent and always in control. "Move over," she said, and the words came out like a prayer rather than a command. There was no flirtation in her tone, no suggestion of romance, just exhaustion so deep it seemed to radiate from her bones. He shifted to one side of the bed without question. Something about the way she was holding herself, like a person trying not to completely fall apart, made any other response impossible. When she climbed under the covers, she stayed carefully on her side, maintaining a respectful distance even as she pulled the blanket up to her chin. For several minutes, they lay there in the darkness listening to each other breathe. He could feel the tension radiating from her body, the way someone holds themselves when they're trying to keep all their pieces together. Occasionally a small sob would escape, followed by a whispered apology that he would gently dismiss. "We lost someone tonight," she finally said, her voice muffled by the pillow. "A mom. She was only 32, same age as me. Car accident on her way home from her daughter's school play." He felt his chest tighten. He didn't know what to say to something like that. Wasn't sure there were words adequate for that kind of loss. So he just listened as she continued talking into the darkness. She kept asking about her little girl while we were working on her. Kept saying she had promised to help with homework when she got home. "We did everything we could, but sometimes everything isn't enough." The rain outside seemed to match the rhythm of her breathing, irregular and unpredictable. He found himself thinking about all the times he had complained about trivial things, about his divorce and his loneliness and his broken air conditioner. Here was someone who spent her days watching people's worst moments unfold, carrying home pieces of strangers' heartbreak. "I sat in my car for an hour after my shift ended," she continued, "just sitting there in the hospital parking lot, watching other people go home to their families. I kept thinking about that little girl, probably wondering why her mom is late, and I couldn't make myself go into my empty apartment and pretend this was just another day." He understood that feeling, the weight of going home to silence after something significant had happened. During the worst parts of his divorce, he had driven around for hours rather than face the quiet rooms that echoed with the absence of the life he had thought he was building. "My ex-husband used to say I cared too much," she said with a bitter laugh. He said I brought other people's problems home with me, that I couldn't leave work at work. Maybe he was right. Maybe that's why he left. No, he said quietly, surprising himself by speaking. Caring isn't the problem. The problem is carrying it all alone. She turned to look at him then, her eyes reflecting the dim light from outside. For the first time since she had entered his room, she seemed to really see him, to remember that she was sharing this moment with another person, rather than just speaking into the void. I don't even know your name, she said, and there was something almost funny about the realization. Here they were, sharing his bed and her deepest pain, and they were still essentially strangers. He told her his name, and she shared hers in return. The exchange felt more intimate than it should have, like they were trading secrets rather than basic information, maybe because they had skipped over all the usual steps of getting to know someone, jumping straight from polite nods in the hallway to this raw moment of vulnerability. I should go, she said, but made no move to leave. This is probably the weirdest thing I've ever done. Breaking into someone's apartment because I couldn't handle being alone. You didn't break in, he pointed out. The door was unlocked, and even if you had, I think I understand why you needed to. They talked until the rain stopped and the first hints of dawn began to creep around the edges of his blinds. About the loneliness of caring for others while neglecting yourself. About the way some days felt too heavy to carry alone. About the unexpected comfort of finding someone else awake in the quiet hours when the rest of the world was sleeping. By morning, something between them had shifted, creating a connection neither had been looking for but both desperately needed. The sun was beginning to paint soft lines across his bedroom wall when she started talking about her childhood. It was the kind of conversation that happens in the early hours of morning, when exhaustion strips away the usual barriers people keep around their private thoughts. They had been lying there for hours, sometimes talking, sometimes just existing in the comfortable silence that had grown between them. My mom always said I was too sensitive for my own good, she whispered, watching the patterns of light shift across the ceiling. When I was 8, I found a bird with a broken wing in our backyard. I spent 3 days trying to nurse it back to health, feeding it water with an eyedropper, making a little nest in a shoebox. When it died anyway, I cried for a week. He turned slightly to face her, careful not to disturb the fragile peace that had settled over them. What did your mom say then? She said that's just how the world works. Things die and you can't save everything, and the sooner I learned that lesson, the better off I'd be. She let out a small laugh that held no humor. Funny how I ended up in a job where I try to save people every single day. There was something about the way she talked about her family that reminded him of his own complicated relationship with the people who had raised him. Parents who meant well but didn't always understand the children they had brought into the world. My dad wanted me to be a lawyer, he said, surprising himself by sharing something he rarely talked about. Said I was good at arguing and that meant I should make money from it. He never understood why I chose teaching instead. Kept asking when I was going to get a real job that paid better. Do you like teaching? She asked, and he could hear genuine interest in her voice rather than just politeness. I love it, he replied without hesitation. There's something amazing about watching a kid finally understand something they've been struggling with. That moment when their face lights up and you know they've got it. It's like being there when a light bulb turns on. They talked about the jobs they had chosen, the weight of other people's expectations, and the way society seemed to value money over meaning. She told him about the patients who stayed with her long after their visits ended. The ones who wrote thank you notes or brought pictures of their children, and the ones who didn't make it home despite everyone's best efforts. The hardest part isn't losing them, she said, her voice getting softer as the room grew lighter. It's the families. Watching someone get the worst news of their life and knowing there's nothing you can say that will make it better. There's no training for that part of the job. He thought about his students, especially the ones who came from difficult homes or who struggled with learning disabilities. The way some of them would linger after class, not because they had questions about the lesson, but because they didn't want to go home yet. There were different kinds of healing, he realized, different ways of trying to help people. I had a student last year, he said, who was failing everything. Smart kid. But he was living in his car with his mom after they got evicted. Hard to focus on algebra when you're not sure where you're going to sleep. I started staying after school to help him, but really I think he just needed someone to notice that he was struggling. Did it help? He graduated. Got a scholarship to community college. His mom sent me a card with a picture of him in his cap and gown. The memory still made him smile. Even months later, she was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's the thing about caring too much, isn't it? Even when it hurts, even when people tell you you're too invested, you can't stop doing it because those moments make it worth it." The conversation drifted to their marriages, the relationships that had ended and left them both questioning what they had done wrong. She told him about a husband who had wanted her to quit nursing, who had said her job was too depressing and that she brought negative energy home. He shared about an ex-wife who had gradually grown tired of his teacher's salary and his tendency to grade papers during their dinner dates. "She used to joke that I cared more about my students than I did about her," he said. "Except it wasn't really a joke, and eventually it became one of those things we fought about. She wanted me to switch careers, said I could make better money in corporate training or something like that. Did you consider it? For about 5 minutes. But then I realized that if I had to choose between being true to myself or staying married, the marriage was probably already over anyway." She nodded like she understood completely. "My ex said I was married to my job, that he felt like he was competing with every patient I treated. Maybe there was some truth to that, but I couldn't figure out how to care less without becoming someone I didn't recognize." As the morning light grew stronger, they found themselves talking about loneliness, about the difference between being alone and being lonely, and about how it was possible to feel completely isolated even when surrounded by people. She described coming home to her empty apartment after 12-hour shifts, too tired to call friends but too wired to sleep. He talked about weekends that stretched endlessly, about cooking dinner for one and watching movies that nobody else would comment on or laugh at. "Sometimes I wonder if this is just how adult life is supposed to be," she said. "If everyone else is just better at pretending they have it figured out." "I think a lot of people are just better at being alone," he replied. "Or maybe they're better at filling the quiet with distractions." They talked about the small rituals that help them get through difficult days. Her habit of stopping for coffee at the same place every morning, where the barista knew her order and always asked about her day. His routine of calling his elderly neighbor every Sunday to check in, conversations that had become as important to him as they were to her. "I think that's what I needed tonight," she said as the room filled with morning light. "Not to be fixed or saved or told that everything happens for a reason. I just needed someone to hear that it was a bad day and that it mattered that it was hard." "It did matter," he said quietly. "And you don't have to carry all of it alone." In the growing daylight, they both knew this strange, intimate night was coming to an end. But something fundamental had shifted between them that would make returning to their separate lives impossible. The morning sun streaming through his blinds felt like an alarm clock they couldn't turn off. Reality was creeping back into the room, bringing with it all the questions and complications that the darkness had temporarily pushed away. She sat up slowly, running her hands through her hair, and for the first time since she had entered his apartment, she looked embarrassed. "Oh my God," she whispered, covering her face with her hands. "I can't believe I did this. I broke into your apartment and climbed into your bed like some kind of crazy person." He sat up too, suddenly aware that they were both still in their undergarments and that the intimate bubble of the night was dissolving in the harsh light of day. "You didn't break in," he reminded her gently. "And you're not crazy. You were hurting." But she was already scrambling to find her clothes, pulling on her wrinkled scrubs with the quick efficiency of someone who wanted to escape as quickly as possible. "This is so inappropriate," she muttered, not looking at him. "You must think I'm completely out of my mind." "I think you're human," he said, but she wasn't listening anymore. She was focused on getting dressed, on putting back together the professional, competent version of herself that the world expected to see. "I should go," she said, stuffing her feet into her shoes without untying them first. "I need to shower and sleep and pretend this never happened." He wanted to tell her that he didn't want to pretend it never happened, that the conversation they had shared felt like the most honest interaction he'd had with another person in months. But she was already moving toward the door, and something about her body language warned him not to push. "Thank you," she said without turning around, "for letting me stay, for listening, for not making it weird." Then she was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of hospital antiseptic and the warmth on the sheets where she had been lying. He sat in his empty bedroom, wondering if the whole thing had been some kind of elaborate dream brought on by too many sleepless nights. The next few days were awkward in ways he hadn't expected. Every time he heard footsteps in the hallway, he would tense up, wondering if it was her. When he checked his mail, He would listen for the sound of her door opening, but it never came at the same time as his. It was as if she was actively avoiding any chance of running into him. On Thursday, he saw her car in the parking lot but didn't see her for 3 days. On Sunday, he heard her television through the thin walls but couldn't bring himself to knock on her door. The easy politeness they had shared before seemed impossible now, replaced by a charged awareness that made simple interactions feel loaded with meaning. 2 weeks passed in this strange dance of avoidance. He found himself taking the stairs instead of the elevator, just in case she was in there. She seemed to be leaving for work at different times, breaking the routine he had unconsciously memorized over the past 3 years. The comfortable anonymity of apartment living had been shattered, replaced by a hyper-awareness of her presence just 20 feet away. He started to wonder if he had misread the entire situation. Maybe she regretted confiding in him. Maybe she was embarrassed about the vulnerability she had shown, about the way she had cried in his bed and told him things she probably hadn't told anyone else. Maybe she was worried about what he might think of her, or what he might tell other people in the building. The thought bothered him more than it should have. He found himself wanting to reassure her that her secrets were safe, that he understood the difference between a moment of crisis and a person's true character. But there was no way to say that without acknowledging what had happened, and she seemed determined to act like it hadn't. His own sleep patterns, which had been problematic before that night, became even more erratic. He would lie awake listening for sounds from her apartment, wondering if she was okay, if she had made it through another difficult shift, if she was sitting alone in her kitchen the way he was sitting alone in his. The loneliness felt different now. Before, it had been a general ache, the background noise of a life that hadn't turned out the way he had expected. Now it was specific, focused on the absence of someone who had briefly made him feel less alone in the world. He missed conversations he had never actually had with her, missed a friendship that had lasted only one night. 3 weeks after their shared morning, he was coming home from grocery shopping when he heard her door open. For a moment, they both froze in the hallway, caught between the impulse to run and the impossibility of pretending not to see each other. She looked tired in a way that went deeper than just needing sleep. Her usually neat hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and there were dark circles under her eyes that hadn't been there before. She was wearing jeans and an old sweatshirt instead of her usual professional attire, and something about her casual appearance made her seem more human, more approachable. "Hi," she said quietly, clutching her car keys like a lifeline. "Hi," he replied, shifting his grocery bags to one arm. They stood there for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds, both of them clearly wanting to say something but not knowing how to bridge the gap that had opened between them. "I've been meaning to," she started, then stopped and shook her head. "I owe you an apology." "No, you don't," he said immediately, but she held up her hand to stop him. "I do. What I did was inappropriate and unfair to you. You didn't ask to be someone's crisis counselor in the middle of the night, and I had no right to put you in that position." He set down his grocery bags, suddenly understanding that this conversation was more important than getting his milk into the refrigerator. "You were in pain," he said. "People do unexpected things when they're in pain. It doesn't mean they're wrong." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he could see her trying to decide whether to trust what he was saying or to retreat back into the safety of embarrassment and avoidance. "I keep thinking about that night," she admitted. "Not just what I did, but what you did. How you just made room for me without asking questions or making me explain myself. That was incredibly kind." The tension in the hallway seemed to shift, becoming less about awkwardness and more about possibility. They were both still uncertain, still figuring out how to navigate this unexpected connection, but at least they were talking again. "Would you like to have coffee sometime?" she asked suddenly, the words coming out in a rush like she was afraid she would lose her nerve. "I mean like normal people do. During normal hours, when we're both wearing normal clothes." He smiled, feeling something tight in his chest finally start to loosen. "I'd like that," he said. "I'd like that a lot." Their first coffee date happened on a Saturday morning at the small cafe 2 blocks from their building. She arrived 5 minutes early, he arrived 3 minutes early, and they both laughed nervously when they realized they were both the type of people who showed up early to everything. The awkwardness from the hallway seemed to melt away as they stood in line together, debating whether to order something fancy or stick with regular coffee. "I'm not really a fancy coffee person," she admitted, studying the menu with the concentration of someone taking a final exam. I usually just drink whatever they have at the hospital, which is basically brown water with caffeine. I make coffee at home that's probably worse than hospital coffee, he said. I buy the cheapest stuff at the grocery store and wonder why it tastes like dirt. They found a table by the window, and for the first time since that night 3 weeks ago, they were able to look at each other without the weight of embarrassment or confusion hanging between them, in the natural light of day. With their clothes on and their guard partially down, they were just two people getting to know each other the way people normally do. So, she said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup like it was keeping her warm. Tell me something normal about yourself, something that has nothing to do with that night or work or any of the heavy stuff we talked about. He thought for a moment, then smiled. I'm terrible at keeping plants alive. I've killed every houseplant I've ever owned, including a cactus that was supposed to be indestructible. I even killed fake plants once by leaving them outside during a storm. She laughed, and the sound made something in his chest relax. That's actually impressive. I think you might have a superpower. What about you? What's your normal, embarrassing secret? I watch cooking shows obsessively, even though I can barely make pasta without burning it. I have about 50 cookbooks that I've never used, but I keep buying them because I think someday I'll become the kind of person who makes homemade bread and grows herbs on the windowsill. They spent 2 hours at that coffee shop, talking about everything except the thing that had brought them together. She told him about her obsession with crime documentaries and her fear of butterflies. He shared his complete inability to understand modern music and his secret love of reality television shows. They discovered they both hated small talk, but were terrible at avoiding it. Both loved thunderstorms but were afraid of flying, and both had complicated relationships with their families that they preferred not to discuss in detail. Over the following weeks, coffee became lunch, lunch became dinner, and dinner became the kind of long conversations that happen when two people discover they actually enjoy each other's company, beyond their shared moment of crisis. They learned each other's routines, favorite foods, and pet peeves. He discovered that she always ordered the same thing at restaurants because choosing made her anxious. She learned that he graded papers while watching television because the background noise helped him concentrate. Their friendship developed slowly, carefully, like two people who had been burned before and weren't eager to repeat the experience. There were no romantic gestures or dramatic declarations, just the steady building of trust between two people who had seen each other at their most vulnerable and decided they liked what they found there. She started knocking on his doctor when she had particularly difficult shifts, not to break down in his bed again, but to sit on his couch and talk through whatever had happened. He would make terrible coffee and listen while she processed the day's challenges, the patients who had made her laugh, the families who had thanked her, the cases that would stay with her long after her shift ended. In return, he told her about his students, the ones who struggled and the ones who excelled, the parents who cared too much and the ones who didn't seem to care at all. She became the person he called when one of his kids had a breakthrough moment, when someone who had been failing finally understood a concept they had been wrestling with for weeks. They developed their own routines and inside jokes. Thursday night became movie night, with alternating choices that led to good-natured arguments about whether action movies were inherently superior to romantic comedies. Sunday mornings became grocery shopping together, not because they needed the same things but because it was more fun than doing it alone. 6 months after that first night, they were sitting in his living room after watching a documentary about ocean conservation, when she brought up what they had both been thinking, but neither had said out loud. "We're not dating," she said, not looking at him while she spoke. "But we're not exactly just friends either, are we?" He considered this, thinking about how their relationship didn't fit into any of the normal categories people use to define connections between two people. They weren't romantic partners, but they were more than neighbors. They weren't just friends, but they weren't family either. "I think we're something else," he said finally, "something that doesn't have a name yet." She nodded like that made perfect sense. "I like that we don't have to define it. I like that we can just be whatever this is without having to explain it to other people or fit it into some category." They had both been through relationships that had demanded constant definition, constant evaluation of where things were going and what everyone wanted. This felt different, more honest somehow. They were two people who had found each other in a moment of crisis and discovered that they made each other's lives better, in small, important ways. I never thanked you properly, she said, finally looking at him. Not just for that night, but for everything since. For being the kind of person who makes room for other people's pain without trying to fix it or make it about yourself. You don't need to thank me, he said. This friendship, whatever we want to call it, it's been good for me too. I forgot what it was like to have someone who actually wanted to hear about my day. Someone who cared whether I had eaten dinner or remembered to take my allergy medicine. As the months continued to pass, they found a rhythm that worked for both of them. They shared meals and movies, supported each other through difficult days, and celebrated small victories together. Neither of them was looking for romance, but they had found something equally valuable. A genuine connection with another human being who understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is simply show up. Their story became one of the quiet miracles that happen when two lonely people decide to be less lonely together, proving that the most meaningful relationships sometimes begin in the most unexpected ways.